We have 3 presentations. Actually, not only 3, we have 4. We'll be hearing from Dr. Klaus Wolf, who is a doctor and a colonel. He's a doctor in the Army Hospital in Vienna. He's going to be talking about strategy in medicine. And for that reason, I would ask him to begin his presentation. Please. Brigadier General, Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. My presentation is called Strategy in Medicine. So we've decided to anticipate the core of my presentation. Strategy in medicine. We know about healing treatments. We know this from the medical history, from excavations in the ancient Egyptians, the pharaohs, for example. We know that skulls have been prepared since Asclepius. We know that the human body has been observed and it's been established that there were deviations from the norm and these were treated. We don't exactly know what kind of treatments this entailed. Since the Enlightenment, we are able to draw on improved data. Since the Enlightenment and modernity, we know from observation that diseases have been under observation with the objective of trying to recognize and identify the reasons for this disease and to cure this disease. This was done observing symptoms, and this was done on the basis of observation and trial and error. Since the modern age, at the end of the 19th century, or the mid-19th century, we started with the natural science approach of observation. The treating doctor, tried to not only observe the disease, but also to draw up a strategy for a cure, for a treatment. This is basically a medical strategy. We have these today as well. Nobody is treated just to combat symptoms. We know this even in the case with chronic and long-term diseases. We know this in the case of cancers, for example. We have multimodal treatment strategies. And this is something where we emphasize the concept of strategies in medicine. If our first approach fails, we have a second approach, a strategic approach. This is Plan B, so to speak, when Plan A is unsuccessful. We're talking about hybridicity, we're talking about resilience, we're talking about cyber, and all of these ideas are very important for medicine. This is very important particularly for cross-cutting understanding of these concepts. I'm going to be focusing on the hybrid section of medicine in the next few minutes in my presentation. In modern medicine, we are using the word hybrid quite frequently. This is often as a way to develop a strategy for reaching an objective. So we have a strategic backdrop. We have a strategic underpinning, for example, in vascular surgery or in vascular medicine. When I have a patient, and where the risk of surgical treatment is too great, and if I have a choice of another strategy that is less risky, then I try to draw on expertise from internal medicine or radiology in order to take a hybrid approach. The hybrid treatment would be radiology treatment, for for example, catheter techniques, and the surgeon on standby in order to repair perhaps vessels that are damaged in some way. So when we have trauma surgery on emergency medicine, this is the summit, if you will, of this type of surgery. We have damage control surgery. This is a concept that has been in play for many years now. Many people are using it today. But this definitely plays a role in coming up with a plan. And this is something that we have used as a role model. So, what does damage control surgery mean? This means we are simply trying to limit the damage. So, emergency surgery since 2003. This is in Afghanistan since 2001. In field medicine, it has been aimed at treating people who have been involved in hostile combat. The plan has been to provide them with medical treatment very quickly to avoid 25% losses that we have seen in the past. So here we have achieved a much lower percentage of 6%. Here I'm able to use damage control surgery in order to limit the damage to 5%. This is in field ambulances. Unfortunately, sometimes people die anyway, but they are no longer dying on the front. They are dying perhaps in other types of hospitals. But I have developed a medical supply network in companies, and we have damage control surgery system in the field hospitals. This means the patients are not only operated under trauma circumstances and maybe would spend a week or 2 weeks in the intensive care unit and leaves the hospital. This would be, of course, the conventional medical treatment. This is not damage control surgery. What is damage control surgery? It means that they usually are brought to the operation room already intubated, and they have arterial injuries. They have often sepsis, or they have a intestinal injury, or even in the thorax region. This means that the key problem has to be tackled first of all. For example, you have to create a bridging system for the vascular problems in the torso, and the part of the intestine that has been damaged has to be removed. This means that the patient is then warmed up, but they've received a particular type of very special treatment. And they are allowed to recuperate for a maximum of 72 hours. Their body is able to recover from the initial shock and of the initial treatment. That sounds really quite traumatic. But this means that the patients that are brought to the field ambulance are not usually able to leave the hospital, but they are transported onward for continued care. In that time, their biological balance is restored, and of course they are usually not awake. They are in an artificial coma. So for me to pursue the concept of damage control surgery, then I need classical surgical training and trauma surgical training. I know how to take care of patients in this way. I have to know what the standards are, how to take care of patients, how to treat patients in normal situations. For example, sometimes the patients would be able to walk into the operation room under their own power, and they would go to the recovery room, and they would be able to thank the doctor then and go home shortly thereafter. This is a classic case. But for me to carry out damage control surgery, and for me to know that what I'm doing entails further training, is that people are trained in damage control surgery. But this means that I have to implement this strategy consistently. We have to know that less is more. This is our main motto. We need an efficient emergency medical system. And we need a number of disposable equipment pieces. So the point is not to expend a great deal of equipment keeping one patient alive. We need to be able to treat as many patients as possible, and to keep the patient alive, as I said, and treat the contamination, and allow them to a 72-hour rest period, and then to transport them on to another hospital for further treatment. So it's important to give them the 72-hour biological resting phase. So we need a air-supported medical evacuation system in the background. And for us to even implement this strategy, we need a recipient hospital to receive these patients, and doctors who know what to do with these patients who have been treated in the field, because the patient has already been treated, has already been subject to an initial treatment. So this means that it's not quite sufficient. For the medics and the doctors on the front line to be trained in damage control surgery, we need the doctors behind the front lines in the hospitals further on down the line. They have to be trained in damage controlled surgery. So what are the restrictions? For example, the environment, the weather for flying. You can have an excellent strategy, you can have an excellent control system. Say we're going to be treating all of the troops according to our damage control surgery strategy. But if we want to evacuate a patient after the 72-hour recuperation period, or at least take him to the airport, we can't do that because the weather is poor, or because the military situation does not allow us to do this. Then I have lost. Then this strategy is unsuccessful. This is a strategy of a hybrid approach. So this means that I do the complete surgical procedure with the idea that they would be treated in a hospital further down the line. This strategy has failed. So another restriction for this strategy of damage control surgery is the human component. This is the patient. We cannot be able to treat all of the patients for this highly specialized treatment in a field hospital. I cannot treat all the patients according to this strategy. That means I have to know what kind of a human component the patient has. Are they part of the troops that are to be subject to this type of treatment? If that is true, then I can perhaps opt for damage control surgery. Or do we know? If the patient can be treated with damage control surgery and can be evacuated out for further treatment, do we know that the patient who has been subject to initial treatment can be treated further by other doctors adequately? Of course, for us, that seems to be quite logical, because we know what kind of expertise we have, but we know from experience that this is not the case. This is not even true in Austria and Germany, or this is certainly not true in Africa, for example. There have been cases on level 4 university hospital where we were asked what to do with the patient, how to treat a patient once they have arrived. As I said, we're taking a hybrid approach. We're using surgical techniques with instruments and equipment. This means that the human component, number 2, is the doctor. What can the doctor do? What kind of competences do they have? What kind of skills does the doctor have? This means that we can train our people. And 80% of this is theoretical. I can simulate ORs as if the patients were to be treated under these circumstances. This is true. At the university, we have 12 universities, or 12 professors worldwide who are trained in emergency field surgery. We also have to make sure that the special systems are available. It doesn't help me one bit if all of the doctors are trained and all the other components are in place. But if the equipment is not in place, then our strategy will again be unsuccessful. So, what are the limits of a hybrid strategy? Well, they are on the meta level. And this is not even a medical level. Who has been trained to plan these treatment strategies? So, are the limitations known for those who are executing the strategy? For example, the weather for flights, or for example, if soldiers are to be evacuated with air support over thousands of kilometers, is the appropriate equipment in place? On the user level, what about the conditions of the environment in which I'm providing this treatment? This is, of course, an environment, a setting that I'm treating one patient after the other, and we want to make sure that nobody receives inadequate treatment, whether or not on the user level, whether or not we are able to provide all of the equipment that we need. These are standards that we've had for over 50 years. So we have the classic base strategy that we have to make sure is also in place. So what are the dangers of hybrid strategy? Well, relying on the modern techniques and on equipment and not mastering the basics. Because if we don't have a modern equipment and I have to rely on my actual skills, then this is a detriment to me because I'm not able to treat my patients adequately. No other treatment options are available to me. So I'm just going to show you a few pictures. This is a rebel from Mali decided to attack a EU vehicle, but failed and had to be treated. The patient came to the OR and was treated, and this decision for the doctors there, and in this case it was me, do I do damage control surgery? Or would that mean that I would have to say goodbye to the patient because nobody in Mali would be able to treat this patient any further, even though they would only be evacuated for about 2,000 kilometers? Or would I be able to stabilize this patient? And we also had the problem that we were able to treat this patient for an extended period of time, where we have to use up a wide spectrum of resources that I could have provided to other soldiers. So the decision was for damage control surgery, an alternative of an alternative, so to speak. And the end of my presentation is quite simply that you need to have a strategy, particularly as a surgeon or the head of a field hospital. You also need to have the strategy in the planning phase. For that reason, everybody has to know what exactly is taking place. Only then can I say the medicine is taking a strategic approach. You have a plan A and a plan B, a fallback strategy. Otherwise, the strategy is not a strategy, but an emergency solution.
Ladies and gentlemen, I may now ask the next speaker to please take the floor. Professor Hardy is going to talk about strategy and health. He's not going to speak for 15, but for 10 minutes only, because Brigadier General Paschke has unfortunately been jeopardizing our time limits a little bit. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. I hope I'm getting to grips with technology soon. Strategy and health. What's the purpose of medicine? It's to combat diseases and help the diseased, those who are ill. In the last year's strategy conference, Professor von Kodelich presented 3 categories of medical strategies to us. I'm going to now shed light on the last of his items. That's the strategic frame or conditions of health supply. Let's look back at the Middle Ages, the starting of modern times. You will know the 4 apocalyptic writers that Albrecht Dürer presented in a cut. The 4 horsemen: hunger, disease, and war. And the impact not only on the poor population. King Edward I and Queen Eleanor had 16 children, only 6 who didn't die when being children. The fatality rate with children was very high. What about today's mortality rates? Today we see everything's here in blue or green on that chart here. All seems to be all right, with the exception of the sub-Saharan region, Africa, but in particular Central African countries. Otherwise, children's mortality could be settled more or less. We've got to grips with that problem. Diseases, you can see that almost every year we see a new disease owed to mutations. Due to tourism and global trade, they are being spread very quickly, but with the ways and means we have, it's quite easy to get to grips with them. You may recall the SARS epidemic with 4,500 fatalities, consistently isolating the deceased and isolating those who might have been contaminated. Stopped that disease quite quickly. The Ebola disease a couple of years ago, due to internationally combined efforts, the WHO and all of the member states made sure to quickly get to grips with that epidemic. And with vaccinations, we could get to grips with major diseases as well. In 1988, when I was a doctor and the chairman was the superior at the Accidental Hospital, polio was a threat in wide areas of the world, and now we find polio only in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and here in the Cameroon corner. There has been major progress, not only due to medicine, but in particular due to hygiene measures. In Vienna, we were in the lucky position that the Emperor Franz Joseph already in 1871 started the construction of the Vienna potable water line, and thus typhoid fever could be eradicated. So you can see many important items play a role here when we see life expectancy being on the rise worldwide, not only with us, but globally. People today die because they eat too much and not too little. They die of weakness, of old age, not because of infectious diseases, and many more commit suicide than those who die due to terror, crime, rates, or war. I really question that. I would like to mention Harari, an Israeli historian. I would like to quote here to quantify the figure. There are about 850,000 suicides worldwide. Globally, WHO provides and publishes these figures. We see Russia, Japan, Korea being the main countries where people do commit those suicides. Let's look at the costs for a moment. Switzerland recently published that 80% of the health costs today go to non-transferable diseases, psychological diseases, and addictions. Let's look at the OECD average and make a comparison. Where is Austria doing particularly badly? Smoking, Professor Kunze, alcohol consumption, ranking second, asthma. Certainly that's a combination with nicotine addiction. Where are we doing particularly well when it comes to prescribing antibiotics? The newspapers would say we swallow way too many antibiotics, but we're doing better than you would find in the papers. Well, why are we above average when it comes to health costs? The number of physicians and the number of beds fully diseased and sick people. So what about the costs accumulated? We have 36.8 billion or 10.4% of the GDP. That's 20 times the defense budget, more or less. So we might say that the health expenses correlate with health. Primarily, yes, that's a black line here, whereas Austria would be located over there. We spend quite a lot, but there is a number of countries who spend way less money than we do. Nevertheless, we do see that the population is much healthier. Israel, for instance, they only spend about 50% of our expenses for health, and they have a higher life expectancy. Or Japan, for instance, higher as well. One of the outliers is the US, who spend much more than we do, but the life expectancy is much lower. Indeed. So there is a whole range of factors that besides the actual cost for medical service have an influence on health, including education, security, traffic, finances. What about education? Did you know that in Austria, an university graduate lives about 6 years longer than a person who's just attended compulsory education? With male people, with women, it's 3 years longer that a female graduate will live longer than someone who just attended compulsory schooling. There are many factors, including health in all policies. HIAP, the Finnish presidency in the European Union, introduced that concept in 2006, in Austria in 2012. It was implemented. What does that mean? Many aspects have to be viewed from a health political point of view. On the other hand, the success of the overall policy has a clear impact on health, and the other way around. Health, the intersectoral investment into health also contribute to the economic and social development of a country. In Austria, there are 10 implementation targets in this field. For reasons of time, I'm not going to shed light on each and every one of them. Labor market policy, educational policy. I already mentioned how important education is in that context, and another aspect about what it's going to look like in the future, because we are also talking about cyber. What will health look like in the future? What did it look like in the past? In the past, it used to be quite easy. When you had a sore throat, you would ask St. Blasius to help you. When your tummy ached, you went to Holy George. When you had headache, Holy Dionysius. And then came the gods in white. That's the current state of the art. And now the first consultation is with Dr. Google, then you go to Dr. Yahoo. Falsified drugs you get from the internet pharmacy. Well, let's wait and see. In future, I think IBM Watson is going to be your family doctor. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I thank the two gentlemen from the military service for their very instructive presentations, and I'd like to give the floor to you now, who are going to talk about strategy and biology. My second attempt, ladies and gentlemen. Just briefly, I'd like to mention that all of my sources are used from a scientific point of view only. What I'm going to try to do with you is talk about bioterrorism, tackle the ideas of potential abuse of new technologies. Let me just remind you of the Bryson case of a Tunisian who mixed bioweapons. That's the rather harmless variant. What's the more interesting one is what the New York Times, for instance, published in May as well. The gene editing gains popularity. We could say it's getting feasible to buy biobricks and change them with KISS being less than $1,000. So it's very easy now to just create your own viruses. What's the starting point? You may have learned about that this beginning of the year. The horsepox virus was rebuilt. That's synthetic biology. With the help of biobricks, a virus was just remodeled, and now we are able to not only create the infectious horsepox virus, but it would also be possible to produce the classical smallpox virus. Some 300 million people had been saved by giving them the vaccination against smallpox virus. So what's happening here, and why is it so simple? Nature published it. Charpentier and Dauda, who established that method in 2011-2012. They got a patent on their method, and subsequently they published it. In a simplified manner, we can say that the DNA can be repaired in a very targeted way, differently than before. I also brought a scheme here, an illustration showing how you can destroy the strands. Anything that makes us ill can be eliminated, or something can be introduced and integrated to heal someone. But you can also change viruses. I don't know whether you can hear the sound of my movie. If you can't hear it, I'm going to tell you. All right. So it's not worthwhile trying it again. Lesch, in that short movie, tried to convey how simple the method is, how cheap it is, and how targeted it is. With high accuracy, we know that from bacteria, genes can be targeted at and can be repaired at the very spot where you want to make the repair. And these strands have a self-repairing mechanism that will make sure that certain strands can be integrated with fantastic therapeutic opportunities. I want to give it a positive touch in the beginning because for 2 years I worked in human genetics when I wrote my doctoral thesis, and I really fell in love with human genetics and all of the possibilities. Many of the diseases that were just a fate for you many years ago can now be explained. We can genetically explain why some people have that disease and others won't be punished by God, as people used to say before. I just picked the Duchenne disease for you, and what you can see here is how with Duchenne, whole strand is missing here. But not only do we see that that strand is missing, but the genetic sequence, 3 base pairs are coordinated for 1 amino acid and 20 amino acids for a protein. And if everything's shifted like here in the picture, you suddenly see new proteins are being produced because the sequence or the order of the letters of what's taken out is worse. And when you look at the disease, you'll see that the likelihood of having an ill son is 50% statistically speaking, 20% because normally male patients will die before reaching adulthood, and sound mothers can be the carriers of this disease. With Duchenne and Peter Tullis, Chinese colleagues could show it with human embryos even, that we can repair this disease. So actually it is possible to use the CRISPR method to repair this disease. You see it in the Journal of Science here. And what did our colleagues do? As I explained the method, the missing gene was introduced and illustrated like here. You can see that the Y-type and the repaired muscles look similar when new muscle is being produced again, and you can see that the muscles have been destroyed erratically, and the older the children get, the less they can move. A fantastic discovery and a fantastic method indeed that might also be used differently. In 2014 we learned that scientists had published a kind of recipe to make the bird flu virus even more contagious, so that it can be transferred easily via the air. And Nature published a special edition referring to these facts, and I attended a meeting, and one of the security consultants of the US government, when being asked whether they should publish it, said whenever it's being sent out on the internet, it will be accessible to everyone, and everyone paying a lot of money will just get that recipe. And what do you do with Nature and Science? And they said researchers submit their material on the internet. What was the danger so far? The biological weapons can be designed in such a way that they are lethal, but the lethal impact can be delayed in such a way that you only discover the danger when the pandemic effect had already been triggered. You may know Dan Brown's novel, who describes exactly what I've been lining out to you. Biological weapons have the unique ability to infect people and spread inexorably if we can't find any antidote in time. From a strategical point of view, this means that we have the barriers, accessibility, components can easily be accessed, the biobricks, and the method can easily be learned. But even if we now said we don't want to do anything for 6 months or 12 months, then just focusing on that production, we could do it. And that means that the danger of getting access to these components is very high. On YouTube you find movies when someone shows how they give them a shot to increase their muscles. These are self-tests, not with a mean idea, but you can do that very easily. The danger of manufacturing and manufacturing conditions, here we have some medium danger, but when it comes to the dissemination or the spreading, the danger is very high, because you can do that easily. You can infect people via food or polluted or contaminated water, and you have the incubation time. So if you do that in a self-test, that danger is really very high, because the real bioterrorist, or people who are absolutely convinced that they are negative utilitarian, some say as few people as possible should suffer. We do enough of good things when we minimize suffering, and a bioterrorist might say, I'm going to spread a virus, we'll all have to suffer for one moment badly, and from then on no one is going to suffer anymore. That's the end of suffering. Just to make it clear to you how it may happen in our heads, or radical environmentalists may say the cancer of our world today are human beings. We just have to eliminate that cancer. These are all ideas you find on the internet. It's nothing I've been inventing here. These are even ideas I already heard from students saying, we are the bad cancerous tumor. If someone means that in very radical sense, saying, I'm also going to give my life, that's a danger that's difficult to handle. Right, we do. Well, to make sure we have a publication, then whatever you find on the internet can always be consumed by everyone, making sure we have a manufacturing ban. That's what Mr. Lesch said, no, because it's simple, easily accessible, and can be easily used, and it's cheap. Against Ebola, these measures were launched, and what's really so difficult with that method is just imagine the AIDS virus would be broken down into bio bricks. You just have to get blood from an AIDS-infected patient, and you try to combine it with a virus like Ebola or something similar so that it's highly infectious but not breaking out immediately. Then you could infect all of the world. And until it will be discovered, it will be so late that everyone will be infected anyway. The only chance you would have to find an antidote as quickly as possible. So we are treading on thin ice indeed. What we found with ricin, the man had been monitored, and we found that he got the ricin in the darknet, and this is how we could find him. So if we said we introduced the Majors of AIDS program, there would be the Big Brother is watching you effect on the other hand, because you know there are many individual perpetrators. Let's say Rabin's killing, and it was a fantastic individual perpetrator. Then you have to have a very close monitoring system, widely spread, to make sure you can detect everything, because all biological students will get into contact with these substances easily. If you try to look who are the endangerers or who could pass on an epidemia, you come to what you've seen in many movies already, the Minority Report, for instance. There's a danger of suspecting innocent people. Another opportunity the researchers wanted to do with the avian flu is we do preparatory research ensuring that we will be the first ones in that field, and they also wanted to invent a vaccination for flu viruses, but the problem is that all of that can be abused as well as soon as it is being published. And there are disaster contingency plans, and that's the problem with the virus. We don't know yet. Well, we might not be aware of what the symptoms are, for instance. Which means that we have the barriers for implementation, making sure we prevent excess. We very often fail because BioBricks and CRISPR is easily accessible. It's about preventing excess and the substance. Because it's contagious, we may fail very easily. And there is an additional problem I would also like to mention. It may happen that someone wants to extinguish groups of our population, who Harry was already mentioned, who showed how the Maori were eliminated with a simple flu virus because their immune system couldn't defend that standard virus. So you may say someone might find any group, any population they don't want, finding some genetic peculiarity, saying, I'm going to program my virus to extinguish that group of people. And you may recall a scene of Mission Impossible when the CEO of a company producing pharmaceutical drugs was infected. At least he thought he was infected by a bad virus, and he used the convincing word saying, I want to make money with it. I want to create a super virus and the vaccine at the same time, and then I can earn a lot of money. So there might be many different players in that game who are interested in using the technology for their benefit, for their interests. It's not very good ideas I'm going to round off my presentation with, but we may have a couple of minutes to also discuss the topic. This is a military problem I also wanted to share with you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Knöpfer, for this very interesting presentation that gave us some insight into the biogenetics that is usually hidden to us as simple surgeons. Of course, we found that very interesting to listen to your presentation. So I would like to ask Professor Kotelich to come and give his presentation, whose title is yet unknown, but we will hear it in just one moment. You have 15 minutes speaking time. So my question is, what are the means for strategies, not just in medicine, but also in a more generic sense? So I have a couple of solutions. For example, theoretical strategy of means, a definition, of course, a complete account taking of all the means you have at your disposal, making lists or making an inventory of everything you have at your disposal. If a strategist is carrying out a strategic calculation, they have to know what means they have at their disposal that can be used. This doesn't matter whether you're talking about medicine, the military, or management. You have to be able to remember these at the drop of a hat. You also have to carry out strategic calculations. You have to know what kind of, as I said, what means you have at your disposal, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. For example, you also have to look at formal descriptions of means. I'm not talking about evaluation or strategy here, but I'm just going to focus on the area of the problem that I have set up for myself. I have actually limited my topic here because the topic is actually very broad. Here you have an overview of the means. What is a strategy? This is a rational action that is aimed at a target. This means you have an actor who is impacting an effector with a particular means, whether these are rhetorical means or with a kitchen knife. It doesn't really matter. But the goal is to use an instrument to influence the ideas or the attitudes or the actions of an effector. Here you have to take a stock of the means you have at your disposal. You have to understand that an instrument is never pure. For example, a kitchen knife, if it's lying around, this is not a means to a strategy. It's a potential resource. It is something you could use to cut, to stab, to scare somebody, to play with, whatever. So it's really just dead material. So what do you need in order to turn a knife into an instrument? You need mobilization. You have to take possession of it. You have to bring it into your field of vision. You have to mention it. You have to make it disappear. You have to do something to it in order to use it for targeted action. Then you actually have to use it. You have to mobilize this resource. You have to use it for a particular purpose. You can cut bread. You could threaten someone. You could murder someone. And this is part of the definition of this instrument in order for you to understand it better. And then you have a framework, if you will, for the action. This is the framework in which the action takes place. In order to understand the use of this resource, this could be used within the context of a play. You can use it to cut your breakfast, to eat. You can also use it in a combat. All of these are frameworks of action that shape activity. For me to have an instrument at my disposal and implement it in a strategy. So here you have a description of the means in the strategy. You have resources. First of all, you have means. Then you have the mobilization of resources. These are actions. And then you have the use of resources. These are also actions. And then to complete the definition, you have the framework of action. You have to define this. Is it are you in combat, or are you at breakfast, for example? So you can see this pyramid that I have drawn for you. So you have a call of task for means. This is the mnemonic device. These are acronyms that you can use. These are the building blocks that you can use in order to remember what I'm telling you here. Although it's extremely complex, even though it is complete, it's important for you to be able to remember, to recall this information. You have call, task, means. So means are exactly all of the acronyms that describe resources completely. Task are all of the forms of action aimed at mobilizing these resources that exist in principle, and call, CAL, are the mechanisms of using these resources. So allow me to break down each of these individual acronyms. So this is the mnemonic device, call of task for means. So the definition of the components of the means, these are called task means, for example. So let us begin with the resources. These are the means. This is a means, this is an acronym. Here you see the key on the left-hand side of the table, materials and machines. This is the M, environment, actors, non-material, and social structure. I left this in English on purpose because medical discourse takes place only in English. And unfortunately has meant that innovative thoughts in German are not accepted for publications. The Americans are the only ones that will accept English, so international discourse is in English. I don't do this because I like to do whatever is in fashion. But what is material and machines? These are all material and machine resources that are necessary for communication, for production, for the use, for the supply, maintenance, disposal, measuring, adjustment, and guidance. These are just a few buzzwords. All of these can be empirically proven. This is something that you see in theory, and they can be applied to practice. There's a great deal of information that goes with this table, and this is just the highest level of abstraction. Here you have the environment. These are the resources from your environment. These are actors, for example. You have institutional coordination, social coordination, for example, systems of rules. For actors, you have coordination, performance components, performance. You have management, for example. You also have rule systems. This is in the form of the state databases or satellite systems. These are things that we have as actors. These are things that we can use as actors. Actors are actors that are used as resources. Here you have to look at the qualities, the features of the actors, non-materials, is everything that Clausewitz talked about as intellectual moral dimensions. These are non-material resources that are essential. Here, I will explain these on a separate slide in social structures. These are all of the social structures that are necessary to enable collective action. In the first place, by creating organizations in the form of an army or a hospital or a particular organization. Of course, there are a number of examples that can be listed here. The non-material resources have been further broken down in this chart. This is a trinity. You have intellectual, physical, and psychological resources. But it's important to see this from a holistic point of view. And actually, the sum of the individual components add up to greater than the sum of its parts. This is very important. These are intangible resources. These are not components that are floating around. All of these are can be derived from materials. So you have physical resources. It's not just the list of individual resources of technology, for example, that they're lying around and can be used. Here, the question is, how are these materials available so that they can be used as a resource, so that they can be used as resilient or stable resource, or whatever adjective you want to use. We want to make sure that it's sustainable and can be used as a whole. you also have you have the resources of responsiveness, for example, and resilience. This is very important. Whys, for example, are the intelligence and intellectual resources, wisdom, intelligence, science, education. These are very important as a metaphysical concept of the intellect, and also these are moral resources. Here, GOL, goal, a unity of group, orientation, and leadership. It's about how cohesive a group is. What about an orientation? Is there a shared belief in something, in a collective, a religion, a particular framework of belief, something that allows people to orient themselves to, something that they share. And of course, leadership is very important. This is the very first word that you hear. You need a unity of leadership as well. And without there is no moral cohesion and no group unity. Here, these are the means. Here you see the materials and machines. Here you see the non-material aspects are in the middle. And the material and the non-material resources are interdependent. Here we touch on the resources, and we're going to talk about activities, the mobilization and use of resources. TASK is the acronym that I've chosen for this. This is the underpinning that makes action possible. This stands for talk, act, shape, and check. There's not much more to it than that. Talking is everything that is communicative action, anything that is communication, coordination of actions that make mobilization possible. And direct action is everything that leads directly to a goal of action. And you have a shape, which is indirect activity. These are creating the conditions for action. For example, I can cut somebody's water off, and they're sitting there and they're 30. They can't fight anymore. There are many people. This is not Clausewitz. Clausewitz would rather take up arms and head into the fray, but there's indirect actions. You could cut off somebody's water supply. And I would warn strategists never to lose sight of direct or indirect modes of action. And this is very important within the context of mobilizing resources. And check, of course, is always checking the current situation and the goal that you're trying to reach. There are many different ways of doing this. You could say, are you ready? This is also a form of checking before you attack, for example. But checking also means preparing a unit of measurement or equipment, for example, on making sure that you have approval for a particular political opinion. All of this comes under the heading of check. So, task. Here you have the four kinds of mobilization of resources, and you have the goal in the middle. Here you have management cycles that integrate the goal in the cycle. But that doesn't make any sense, because that would mean that you would lose sight of your goal if you haven't reached it yet. And of course, that's nonsense. So you may have to redefine your goal. And of course, that is a strategic decision. Clausewitz, of course, knew this in devising his strategy that he went to battle with. So you see that the goal is, of course, not part of the inventory that we use to activate resources. So we have task. Here you have the four general forms, basic forms of mobilizing of means. So selection of means, mobilization of means, and using means via cow. And this means that action is something that is all around us. This is something we see every day. So what is the goal of our activity? This is called CAL. Of course, this is very bad English, but we need call as an acronym. So you have corporal, you have affectional mechanisms, and logical mechanisms. Corporal Those are mechanisms where the activity is aimed at the physical body. So if people are infected, for example, or suffering from a disease, this is an activity that comes under the heading of corporal. People are using this virus to attack a person's physical integrity. Affectional, this means actions that are primarily aimed at emotions and morals. I can devastate somebody emotionally without even touching them physically, and that is often enough to force somebody to take action in one direction or to prevent them from taking action for a particular goal. Deterrence plays a very important role in deterrence mechanisms or logical mechanisms. These are areas where I can impact an effector in having an influence on their knowledge or thinking or the logical conclusions. For example, I can provide manipulated knowledge, or I can provide reservations, for example. There are enormous tables and databases in order to take that concept further, but just as a brief overview here, you have there are only 3 goals here. You have the means, you have the body, the soul, and the mind. And the levers that you use to do this are either physical, logical, or affectational mechanisms. I don't think there are any more. Of course, there are many people who may object to that, but I think there are mixed forms of this. There may be forms that blend 1 or 2 of these together. So, the types of action, here there are 3, the most important. And this is based on a basic idea from Clausewitz, who said that the means of war are the battle, the losing and winning of the battle, of the combat, depends on whether or not you obtain a victory or you suffer defeat. And this was his philosophy of means. He said that combat is the means, is the strategy. And I think that's correct. And this is the unit of action, and this is the question that I'm asking here, particularly within the military setting. Of course, for combat, you have to have a purpose, you have to have a goal, and you have to say how it begins and how it is to end. And I have applied this logic to management and to medicine as well. Often here you have therapeutic interventions as the smallest unit. This includes a diagnosis. For example, I have given you the diagnosis, you have pain, but there's nothing wrong with you. And this idea and the strategy, there's a therapeutic intervention. Somebody comes to you and says, it doesn't feel well, and I can ask, how are you feeling? Well, I have pain here, but a logical operation, of course, is not necessary. Of course, a therapeutic unit is the smallest unit of medicine, and you have the repetitive action here in the therapeutic and medical interventions. So the deal here is the field of action in management. Okay, so I'm going to wrap this up. I just wanted to show you something very briefly. In drawing all of this together, I would like to illustrate a particular instrument to you. All of this has to make sense. Why are we focusing on the theory of means, of instruments? Because we as strategists are called upon to use our means, our instruments, our resources as sparingly as possible, but also as successfully as possible. So there's a great deal of literature in management, in military, and in policy making, full of advice on how to use our resources very effectively. So we can look at this from a pharmaceutical point of view, look at the pharmacodynamics. So we have to look at this as dependent on the effector. Of course, it can be the same everywhere, but this is a completely new topic for a new presentation. But you can look at actor, effector, front and back. You can see the list of task means. And of course, you can juxtapose the different means vis-a-vis to each other. You have an A-axis. This is the horizontal axis. These are all actors, action and affection. if you look at that axis, there's something wrong on that axis. If I have a strategic plan and I want to achieve something and I don't have action or actors or affection, then I can just forget it. I can just go home. So this is the essential axis of strategic activity. And if this is not in place with my opponent, of course, then I will be able to claim a victory. Of course, affections are your convictions that you have. So affection or A-axis is very important. And the call axis is also extremely important because this is the level on which our resources and our actions can be understood mechanistically, how they are employed. So let's take Germany as an example, as the effector, and as actors, or we take actor is Germany, and the effector is terrorists. We look at our resources and their resources, then we can carry this over research. We look at non-material and moral resources and action, etc. We can come up with a very simple approach to a strategic calculation that, I believe, would provide answers to strategic questions. So, thank you very much for your attention.